Today at the National Press Club, Chair of A New Approach and President of the Myer Foundation, Rupert Myer. With a long career involved in arts and culture, he's served as Chair of the Australia Council for the Arts and the National Gallery of Australia. Rupert Myer with today's National Press Club address.
Hello and welcome to the National Press Club and today's Westpac address. We're coming to you from Ngunnawal and Ngambri country. My name is Julie Hare and I'm the Education Editor at the Australian Financial Review and a Director here at the National Press Club. Our guest today is Rupert Myer. He is the President of the Myer Foundation and Chairman of A New Approach, a think tank focused on art and culture. He's also one of Australia's foremost philanthropists and has been at the epicentre of the Australian arts community for decades, with senior roles on the Australia Council, the National Gallery of Australia, Opera Australia, National Gallery of Victoria, Melbourne Symphony. The list goes on and on. 20 years ago, Mr Myer chaired a federal government inquiry into the visual arts and crafts that sought to lift investment and recognition in Australia. That inquiry reportedly led to a significant increase in ambition and greater confidence of artists overseas. But it also saw many recommendations, and I quote, remain in the shroud of lost opportunity. We all know what that means. So perhaps there is a sense of déjà vu as we embark on a national arts policy in Australia today and some bold ideas from Mr Myer. You can follow the conversation at Press Club Ost or hashtag NPC. Please welcome Rupert Myer.
Thank you very much, Julie, for that warm welcome. I acknowledge the traditional custodians of this region, the Ngunnawal and Ngambri people. I also acknowledge other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people joining today. Always, and perhaps even more so today in the context of the topic, I'm deeply grateful for your continuing culture and your contributions to the creative life of Australia. And thank you to those of you here at the National Press Club, one of Australia's foremost cultural institutions. It's really lovely to look around the room and see a number of familiar faces, and thank you for joining online from all over, including, I gather, Thursday Island in the north, Geraldton in the west, Merrick's North in the south, and from capital cities and many other special places. We gather today to speak about arts, culture and creativity. The topic is Australia becoming a cultural powerhouse. But I cannot begin this address without acknowledging the death last week of Mark Beeson. His inspiring cultural philanthropic legacy will live on for generations, and I express my sympathies to the entire Beeson family. An Australian embassy anywhere in the world is, in its very nature, an expression of Australia to the world. I wish I had been there when the new Australian Embassy in Washington was opened by the Prime Minister just last month, in fact, less than a fortnight ago. If I had, I'd have been looking at an assured building designed by Australian architects Bates Smart, clearly differentiated from the surrounding civic architecture. The building is bold, contemporary, light-filled and welcoming, reflecting the distinctive Australian landscape. Embedded throughout the building are artworks by artists who reflect Australia today, First Nations people, migrants and people who've been here for generations. Inside and out, this new Australian embassy expresses Australia's maturing cultural assertiveness and our desire to share a contemporary cultural identity with the world. By contrast, 60 years ago, when the same firm designed the original embassy in Washington, the brief was to create an architectural presence that looked at home in the United States Capitol. It was understated and respectful in white masonry to comply with the city's code so that it merged perfectly into all the other international buildings. We have now changed our style of thinking from striving to fit in 60 years ago to now boldly asserting a distinct Australian identity. The contrast between the two buildings tells us much about how Australia perceives itself. Today, by some measures, Australia is a cultural powerhouse, but we have not yet cemented our place. If we do, the evidence shows that Australia can have a future in which our people are healthier and happier, our communities are more connected, our nation is more prosperous, and our region is more stable and sustainable. If we act now, we can benefit from our maturing cultural confidence both at home and abroad. We can deploy our 122 billion cultural and creative industries to support the social and economic strategies they directly and positively impact. And we can refine and accelerate the process of how we present ourselves to the world and share a contemporary Australian identity. One of the largest global platforms for presenting our contemporary identity is now less than a decade away. The 2032 Brisbane Olympics and Paralympics are our opportunity to share a new story about Australia. Being nearly 1/3 of a century on from Sydney in 2000, the imperative is to present ourselves truly as we are: diverse, imaginative, witty, and deeply immersed in our simultaneously ancient and contemporary cultures. In the next decade, we can secure our place as a cultural powerhouse. Doing so is more closely within our grasp than is commonly imagined, but it's up to us all to make it happen. I hope by the end of my address today, you recognise your own unique part that you need to play. The term cultural powerhouse encaptures a vision of Australia as a forerunner in how we respect and cherish our unique cultural inheritance, invest in and celebrate our creators, cultural organisations and creative industries, enable our citizens to participate in and contribute to cultural activity, and strategically plan and nurture our creative future in a manner that befits our standing as the world's 12th largest economy. What would this look like in practice? It would be a public who continue to show up in large numbers, take part, and relish arts and cultural events. Governments at all levels that collaborate effectively and recognise arts and culture as an investment, not a cost. A cultural and creative industry more ready to earn and own its place both here and globally. A business community that's backing and supporting our creative talent and investing in culture and creativity. A philanthropic community that is energised to play a key role. And a broad, vigorous and competitive media ready to be part of asserting that Australia is that place. Today, I will talk about each of these in turn. Our pathway to becoming a cultural powerhouse began with First Nations cultural and creative practices observed over millennia. These practices are globally unique, have endured despite profound disruption over the last 2.5 centuries, have diversified spectacularly through new art forms, new media, and cutting-edge production techniques. Being home to these enduring cultures, as well as the cultures of peoples from every country on earth, is one of our key advantages. In how we live and in what we experience, we can move seamlessly from appreciating the performances of our children in school halls, listening to a favourite radio program, being immersed in a digital game or digitally traversing ancient rock art, attending a country music festival or a radically reinterpreted 19th century opera, to reading one of our authors in our own armchair. This entwinement is all ours and it is of us, and it is what underpins a greater cultural confidence that we can all share. The good news is that within our daily lives, each of us will be able to think of many examples. One of my current favourites is Bluey. Right now, this animated sensation is presenting our own stories, myths, fables and insights to audiences young and old on television and devices right across the country and around the world, from suburban Washington to suburban Beijing. Bluey doesn't announce herself as Australian, but Australian is the lingua franca of the series. With graphics and characters developed here, it is us telling our stories in our accents, sharing our values from our place, showing what life here is like to a connected global world. If you only have 7 minutes, watch the cricket episode. Throughout the series, we are reminded that we don't need to wear a slouch hat to turn up as Australians. By the most democratic of measures, that of public participation, Australia is already a cultural powerhouse. In fact, Australians are outstanding attendees at cultural events and venues. According to the Australian Bureau of Statistics, 82% of Australians reported attending cultural events and venues pre-COVID. To put that 82% in context, in the European Union, it was 64%. Embedded in these statistics is the joy, the belonging, and what has been described as the collective effervescence of being part of an enraptured audience. The ABS also found 1/3 of adults do at least one creative activity, such as playing a guitar, painting and drawing, performing in a show, participating in a community choir, doing a craft activity, or writing a story, and I reckon just about everyone in the room is covered by that list. We are not just passive audience members waiting for someone else's creativity to wash over us. We are in it immersively and habitually. In short, we are global stars when it comes to turning up, getting involved, being fans, and giving creativity a go. It takes different forms and it's experienced in different ways. And yes, it's radio and magazines, war memorials and national parks, as well as architecture, video games and fashion. For most of us, there's a powerful beat of creativity that sits in our everyday, deep, daily cultural connection. Donald Horne's famous dictum in The Lucky Country that sport to many Australians is life and the rest a shadow may have been true 70 years ago, but in Australia today, the deep pervasiveness of arts and cultural engagement and participation has irreversibly illuminated that shadow as it relates to arts and culture. Over decades, our sporting infrastructure has become our cultural infrastructure, with millions of Australians and visitors attending our major facilities around the nation for concerts and events. Just two artists, global superstars, Ed Sheeran and Taylor Swift, will within 12 months attract nearly 600,000 fans to just one venue, the MCG, for 5 concerts in all. That's the equivalent of 6 AFL Grand Finals. Yes, they're not our own stars, but a cultural powerhouse recognises talent from everywhere. And around the country, we turn up in droves for the big events and for the small ones too, for Australian and international performers. So why are so many Australians so keen on culture? To answer that question, a new approach asked them in a nationwide study exploring attitudes towards arts, culture and creativity. In rooms and Zooms around the country, we brought together people from low to middle income households living in outer suburban and regional areas in every state and territory. Everyone we brought together was politically unaligned. They had swung their vote more than once at both federal and state or territory level. We spoke with 3 generations aged between 18 and 75, and the researchers were briefed very explicitly. Don't just tell us the good news, we want to know what people really think. And they said, arts, culture and creativity are essential to being human, are broad, inclusive and for everyone, foster imagination, expression and innovation, and are the building blocks of healthy communities and thriving places. Australians say a world without arts and culture would be colourless, depressing, uninspiring, and like a totalitarian state. As one person in the study said, without arts and culture, you may as well live on Mars. And Australians expect that participation should be possible for all and think that governments have a key role to play in this. My message for the public is simple. Good work. Keep doing what you're doing. And now that we're out of the worst of the COVID pandemic, let's get back to our 5-star engagement levels. And next time you see your local Member of Parliament, tell them how much you like your local festivals or pub performances or visiting galleries or buying Australian designs for your children or your children also being able to do dance classes or watching Australian drama on television. There is political potency in arts and culture. Don't be shy in making this plain. Over time, We have had successive governments responsible for stewarding our nation's cultural institutions and places. They have all been part of the journey to develop a policy, regulatory and legislative environment, as well as the training pathways, investment mechanisms and infrastructures that are necessary for arts, culture and creativity to contribute fully to the lives of all Australians. That commitment of time and the legacy that it has created across the nation should speak of a place where arts and culture are deeply embedded in policy, are considered to be electorally significant, and are enthusiastically encouraged by culturally confident leaders keen to ensure that on their watch, their actions build on what has gone before them. We are not yet that place. Both small steps and huge strides are needed for us to be that place. There is progress. Pleasingly, the Australian Government's new Measuring What Matters framework lists creative and cultural engagement as a key indicator, and I wholeheartedly applaud the Treasury's recognition of this as an essential part of well-being in this nation. The National Cultural Policy, launched at the start of this year, also signals new momentum around the country, alongside the major new cultural and creative industry policies in development in states and territories and local governments. However, we need a sustained vision beyond any single government. This vision must be confident, committed and coordinated to take us to where we can and should be. We need purposeful cross-government investment, and we need bold, integrated and future-focused policy settings that recognise the role arts, culture and creativity play in the lives of Australians and our economy. There are 4 things we can do now to make that happen. As my first call to action, I urge the members of National Cabinet, our Prime Minister, Premiers and Chief Ministers, to commit to closer collaboration on their actions to champion Australian creativity and culture. A concrete way of doing this would be to elevate the existing meeting of cultural ministers to a formalised ministerial council reporting annually to National Cabinet. National Cabinet is the critical authorising environment for the cross-government work that is needed for Australia to thrive in the 21st century. This elevation would be a transformative step to give higher priority to the nation's cultural needs. Crucially, this new ministerial council should be tasked with developing an intergovernmental plan for long-term collaboration. This plan should be a formally negotiated mechanism between governments with a multi-decadal remit across access, workforce and infrastructure outcomes. Importantly, this should be explicitly non-partisan and local government must have a seat at the table. International and Australian research confirms that arts and culture have direct positive impacts on cohesion, health, sustainability, security and prosperity. Providing access to arts and culture for all Australians, whoever they are and wherever they live, is not simply a matter for the arts portfolio. This is a critical whole-of-government responsibility. My second call to action is for the creation of a single, well-funded institution that leads Australia's international cultural relations. Of the top 15 economies of the world, Australia is the only nation not to have an organisation of this nature. Australia should explore what model works for us, ideally through a study commissioned by the Ministerial Council. Such an institution might bear some similarities to the Japan Foundation, the Korea Foundation, Germany's Goethe Institute or the Alliance Française. In my view, our institution must be nimble and must be responsive. We can't rely on a multi-agency approach to this critical function. Others have advocated for an institution of this type to be added to our cultural architecture to give demonstrable representation to the world of Australia's cultural maturity, and I'm pleased to join the chorus. We have a responsibility to tell our part of the human story through the power of arts, culture and creative practice, as demonstrated by our sister nations and their global arts councils, institutes and alliances. This is essential for any mature economy. My third call to action is to use more effectively the cultural assets that our nation possesses. In the last decade, cultural diplomacy has been rebranded as soft power. In fact, there is nothing soft about it. It is very serious business with serious intent, and we underestimate its forcefulness. It is a power to be exercised both domestically and internationally. By example, the collections held here in Canberra in the National Gallery of Australia, established progressively over time, tell a powerful story of what we have valued in the past and value for present and future generations. We have vast collections of work from Australia, from Europe, Asia and America. That much is known. But how can we animate it further to our strategic advantage? Who knows that we also hold one of the world's richest collections of textiles from Indonesia, many of which are from Banda Aceh. This is significant because so many collections housed in Banda Aceh were destroyed by the tsunami there. And yet, instead of proudly starting a country delegation visit at a cultural institution to view these types of collections and share what we value as a nation, this may get programmed as an option on the visit while the business gets done elsewhere. Other countries, often with less directly relevant collections, are more strategic about how they use cultural engagement to win friends and influence people. A cultural powerhouse knows itself deeply, it knows what it has and how to effectively press its advantage. My fourth call to action is to recognise the role that Australia's cultural and creative industries can play in addressing the nation's most complex and pressing economic matters: sluggish productivity, labour shortages, changing skills needs, sticky high inflation, and the need for economic reform. We recognise cultural and creative industries as drivers of ideas, adaptation and connection, but they also create economic opportunities for our nation and employ more than 700,000 people. The recent federal budget's focus on modernising our industrial base identified the creative industries as one of 3 strategic industries, and cultural engagement by our broader population is recognised as developing the creativity, communication and collaboration skills needed across our 21st century workforce. We can do this and reap the benefits through being smart and strategic about the sum the nation invests and without increasing cost of living pressures or the likelihood of other financial imbalances. This is Australian industry now, and the opportunity exists to harness these benefits to build Australia's future. Let's not treat them as a nice to have, but instead take a policy and investment approach that properly reflects the cultural, social and economic benefits they bring to people's lives. Now I turn specifically to the cultural and creative sector. Given that Australia is a source of globally loved creators, producers, technical experts and presenters, it's odd that many in the industries don't recognise and celebrate it themselves. Australian talent extends way beyond the objects that we create and the performances that we produce. We regularly export to the world some of the most highly regarded cultural leaders of our time. We rightly get excited when an Australian turns up as the head coach of an English Premier League team. We should also be proud, if not ecstatic, when our cultural leaders are performing and creating and leading cultural organisations and projects across a wide arc of geography and influence, as they are in art galleries, film studios, festivals and opera houses across the world, along with scooping literature prizes, dominating game design, fabricating large-scale artworks, writing musical scores and starring in comedy festivals. And this has been going on for decades. So today I urge all those working in Australian arts, cultural and creative industries to see themselves as others already do. You are leaders and your experiences, skills and contributions are respected, valued and highly sought after. Whilst I know and understand that it may not always feel like that, Australia already enjoys a cachet in the world that can be grown and developed. What of the business community? Arts, cultural and creative industries are proven drivers of innovation, yet business seems to be slow at recognising and engaging homegrown talent. Recruiting next-generation skills across creative disciplines can be transformative to internal thinking, processes and culture. Buying off-the-shelf overseas solutions designed for other places doesn't nurture and develop our greatest resource, our smart people. A recent McKinsey study found that companies embracing creativity outperform their peers with above average organic revenue growth, total return to shareholders and net enterprise value. And they're more innovative, scoring 16% higher than the average consumer-facing company. My invitation to business is to more fully embrace the creative talent that is on your doorstep. Know that they are here and create strategies to bring them into your businesses. I'd also like to share a perspective with corporate Australia about cultural sponsorships, which I distinguish from philanthropy. In general terms, philanthropy is the gift and sponsorship is the deal. There can be some overlap and both can be strategic, but there are different ideas that are brought to each, and it's sponsorship that I address here. Corporate Australia, you should think of your cultural sponsorships as amongst your most prized assets. They enhance your brand, your reputation, and your value as a business. If you are in any doubt, speak to other corporations who have serially and consistently maintained or expanded their support for cultural organisations over time. They get it. And as an aside, how is it even possible that global businesses operating in Australia with billions of dollars of contracts don't see either the obligation or the economic and strategic advantage to them in investing in this country's arts and culture? How do those Australians signing those contracts not ask the question and demand it? For Australia to become a cultural powerhouse, we need all parties to subscribe to that vision. I turn now to the very particular role that philanthropy might perform in supporting Australia to become a cultural powerhouse with a narrower focus on the creative arts and those cultural organisations serving the public good. I recognise the good fortune that Australia has in the many philanthropic acts over time and more recently that have supported our nation's cultural development. And it would be remiss of me not to acknowledge the philanthropic supporters of a new approach and the extraordinarily long and deep connection that they have with arts and culture. The spirit of philanthropy is private and individual, and no two philanthropic organisations are the same. They have different priorities, purposes and objectives, different governance structures, competing funding programs and different financial capacities and timeframes. Whilst the philanthropic sector itself is subject to legislation, the philanthropic acts themselves cannot be directed by governments, though government and philanthropy can work collaboratively, and often they leverage each other's investment, recognising some areas of common purpose. Building Australia's arts and cultural sectors forms a logical alignment between government and philanthropy, and the alignment is one that can be supported by both generous individuals and philanthropic institutions. Indeed, this alignment is one that has existed all along, with generations of support for public institutions such as galleries, museums, libraries and performing arts centres. However, participants in the philanthropic sector are often stuck on whether they should support arts and culture, and if yes, how. If your terms of reference permit it, my firm advice to you is yes, you should, and you should do so with trust and confidence in the expertise, creativity and grit of cultural organisations and individual creators. And you should do so to support Australia's quest to become a cultural powerhouse. Your other program areas will be enhanced by you having a foot in this practice, and the crossover of funding will benefit your overall philanthropic impact. In a world where outcomes and impacts get measured and evaluated to within an inch of their lives, the remark that I hear so often, particularly in the cultural sector, is, "You won't know this, but..." And a personal story gets shared with me about a philanthropic grant that was made at a critical juncture in that person's life or in the life of an organisation. They say, "You took a chance on me. I was trusted. If I hadn't been backed at that moment, had it not been for that grant." These dangerously unscientific anecdotes of utterly transformative grant-making speak to what philanthropy is and what it does. And it is the subset of philanthropy, cultural philanthropy, that draws the philanthropic sector closer to the creative heart of the nation. The DNA embedded in these types of grants and the relationships that are formed is a DNA that improves all grant-making. Philanthropy is the best social venture capital that there is. By applying it to creators, the creative arts and cultural organisations, it is enabling Australia's culture to flourish with known multiplier benefits across the whole economy. My encouragement is to take the chance and keep doing it, and then look forward to the anecdotes and the impact. Harness the freedom of philanthropy to work for long-term public benefit. Finally, to the media and our host today. My counsel is to recognise the singular contribution that mainstream media can play by meaningfully giving visibility to Australia's arts and culture. Your listeners and readers are already deeply engaged. The opportunity is to recognise the vibrant and valued role that everyday Australians place on their own cultural participation, celebrate the nation's creative achievements and the many individual ones. You have an important part to play in asserting Australia's cultural confidence. So how will we know when we have become a cultural powerhouse? We'll be a cultural powerhouse when we have an engaged public, tick. Governments at all levels that collaborate effectively and recognise arts and culture as an investment, not a cost. Work to be done. A cultural and creative industry more than ready to own our own place in global arts and culture. On the way. A business community that's backing, supporting and investing in culture and creativity. Work to be done. A philanthropic community that recognises it has a key role to play. Bravo to some, work to be done for others. A broad media ready to be part of asserting this place. Work to be done. An ability to independently benchmark, track and evaluate our efforts. ANA is tackling that one. What do you want your Australia to look like in 2035? It's my view that Australia can be a place where arts, culture and creativity thrive in its fullest expression. We can have a pro-culture, legislative, regulatory and leadership environment fostering a cultural sector that's able to invest in its own success. In ANA's estimation, we can be home to a $270 billion industry that employs almost 1 million people. We can celebrate arts, culture and creativity as part of what it means to be an Australian both here and abroad. There is no other country like ours on earth, and yet we are connected to every other country on earth. There are bigger conversations that we can have in this era, and our cultural engagement can deliver us into them. We have a point of difference. Some of those differences are expressed magnificently in the new Australian Embassy in Washington. Like Bluey, we can be ourselves and don't need to parade our Australianness. We can exercise our cultural confidence and our creative strength as a mature nation of the 21st century. Thank you.
Thank you. You obviously have a very enthusiastic audience here. So I live in Canberra, you're visiting Canberra, and I would say our national collecting institutions should really be, the heart and the soul of Australia as a cultural powerhouse. But we know they've been neglected financially over many years, so much so that I think the National Gallery was using its acquisitions budget to plug holes in the roof. In April, the institutions were awarded $530 million by the federal government. But after years of chronic underfunding, is that enough? And what else will it take to rebuild them into first-class, to world-class institutions? Is Tony Burke's obvious passion for the arts and culture enough?
I perhaps would have had a better answer for this when I was chair of the National Gallery. However, I'm prepared to wade in. I mean, clearly, it's a fabulous development that there is now budget set aside. And I think you're right. If a country is to assert itself as a cultural powerhouse, then the capital city of that country needs to have strong, well-funded, well-supported central cultural institutions. Canberra has a fabulous framework of those institutions, and I think it is beholden on, in a non-partisan sense, for those institutions to be well supported, both for their capital needs as well as their recurrent funding needs.
But why is it that the War Memorial got $530 million to build a new building and knock down an already award-winning one, while the other ones were plugging holes in their roof? I mean, there is something odd about this kind of set of priorities, isn't there?
It's a really good question, and I would make the point, and I think I hope it's a helpful one. The National War Memorial is a cultural institution too. So if there's any example that can be given to the government as to how important it is to honour, respect, maintain, create inspiring places, the example of that I think will have a magnificent impact on the whole of Canberra, as well as to the national cultural institutions that have been less fortunate in this round.
Okay. But do you feel, sorry for harping on about the subject, but do you feel that, you know, the national arts policy, the $530 million at the beginning of the year, is this a step towards achieving what you've spoken about today? Or is it just like a little kind of tidy baby step?
Look, it's certainly a step towards achieving it. I think in the context of the, as you say, the National Cultural Plan and the additional funding that's coming into the national cultural institutions, that does reflect a country that better recognises the assets that it has and the way in which it must present itself in order to become a more relevant cultural powerhouse in the world. The inverse of that is unthinkable.
Okay, thank you. Our first question is from Tom McElroy from the AFR.
Thank you, Julie. Thank you for your speech, Mr. Myer, and for taking our questions. I wonder if you'd reflect on your business expertise and give us a sense of how difficult it would be to convince company directors, CEOs, to look to creativity, to invest in it as part of their bottom line and as part of growing their business and employing more people, instead of being an add-on, that it would be a fundamental part of that.
Yeah, look, thanks, Tom. And it's a really great question, how to embed creative thinking around boardrooms and across management teams around the country. And there are some great examples of businesses that do it well. You know, Grand Experiences that runs Loom in Melbourne, for example, is a global business. A small bicycle wheel manufacturer in Geelong, Partington, is using the best possible global technology at the moment to create something that's extraordinary for those who want to ride bicycles really fast. A business even like Who Gives a Crap, which generally puts a smile on people's faces. The way in which they've developed that product and developed it internationally are all examples of how you sort of draw creativity and imagination into the boardroom and into the management team. So there are models out there. I think what disappoints me sometimes, and I experience it firsthand, is when those born overseas, off-the-shelf solutions are sort of brought into the Australian culture of our businesses here, and guess what? They don't fit so well. And there have to be modifications made, and by the time the modifications have happened, why not start out with Australian designers who are in that space? And they're here in droves.
Thank you. Our next question, Melissa Code from the Mandarin.
Hello, Melissa Code from the Mandarin. At this time when you call for Australia to become a cultural powerhouse, we also sort of face existential disruption, both culturally in terms of how Australia sees itself, but also in the digital sense. And many government agencies sort of think about the citizen experience, both from the perspective of their physical experience as like a person here in the room, and also their digital experience. Is what you've proposed today, both in terms of the sort of, singular institution convening Australia's arts and culture policy, does any of that contemplate what AI might do in terms of the disruptive space for arts culture policy?
The call for the single agency was directly related to the way in which Australia presents itself internationally. Mm-hmm. So it would be an enhancement to what already happens here with the existing institutions. So I sort of make that point. Obviously, there's some crossover between those. I think you're absolutely right in the premise of the question. The AI experience, the virtual experience, and the actual experience are all merging. In fact, they already have. In a couple of weeks' time, we're going to a performance of Maria Callas performing live with the MSO. Well, not really. But of course, it's hologram technology, and she's present on the stage singing her arias with the MSO backing. I mean, that's I think a really great example of the way in which everything is fusing across different experiences, and the number of events that we all go to and have our phone with us, using the phone either as a guide or part of the overall experience itself. It's done. It's happened. So what happens from here with AI? I think it's going to be a further expansion of what we've already experienced. In fact, a new approach has just completed a major report on AI, which has recently been released. And the premise of that is exactly that this is no passing fad. It's going to be integral in the creative process. We'd like to think it's going to be directed by creators, and that's going to be interesting to observe over the next many years.
Thanks. Can I just interrupt here? We keep talking about becoming a cultural powerhouse, so you kept referring to that as we're not quite there yet. But when I look back at the 1980s, and I'm old enough to have actually been around in the 1980s, Australia was a cultural powerhouse in terms of film, in terms of fashion, in terms of art, in terms of food, in terms of live music and literature. How did we get to where we are now when what we had then was also uniquely Australian? It was very Australian. Do you have a sense of, do we suffer from cultural cringe, and if so, why?
Oh, gosh, I hope not. I hope we're over that one. Look, I think there have been periods in Australia's history where we've been very tuned into our cultural expression and to our arts. It was a group of poets who turned up in front of Prime Minister Deakin in 1907 to say that there needed to be a fund set aside to promote literature, and Deakin agreed. I often sort of imagine how that would happen today in that sort of context. So there are absolute moments. There are, if you consider, and I acknowledge my involvement with the Felton Bequest, but the ability that the Felton Bequest has had for nearly 120 years to be acquiring works of art for the National Gallery of Victoria. The collections here that I've referred to of the NGA are extraordinary. People travel from around the world to come and see what is hanging on the walls here. And to engage with the life of the institution through meetings with curators. So part of the great talent and the treasure of these institutions is the people that work there. So look, I think you can find various periods of time. Whether the 80s was even more extraordinary, I remember the 80s fondly pretty well too, but whether by any particular metric it's possible to assert that the 80s was somehow a moment in time where Australia was more of a cultural powerhouse than it is now. What I would say is that, what I've outlined today in my remarks is that there are a couple of, I think, relatively straightforward ways in which we could move towards being a cultural powerhouse. And the point of speaking about the Brisbane Games is that's a 10-year window. What a great thing to have a 10-year window when you're talking about something that is multi-decadal in nature. Putting those planks in place with some of the architecture that I described for how the government might approach this, I think would be a really excellent way to sort of ensure that we can cement that role.
Okay. Next question, Nick Stewart.
Thanks. Following Julie's question, in the 90s, Paul Keating began talking about the story of Australia as being very economically dominant, that really we needed to make things, and gradually we saw economic prosperity as being the meaning of life. How is it that you actually try to turn that now so that we begin seeing that there's more to life than simply having a harbourside mansion, particularly as not everyone can get a harbourside mansion? And I know I'm speaking for the journos when I say that.
Yeah, look, it's a really good question. Reflecting on how to drive a philanthropic response from those who may have capacity to engage philanthropically in the sector is, I think, one part of the question. And the second part is how do we continue to ensure that Australian audiences come from all over and participate and have access to great arts and cultural experiences. Was that at the heart
Yes,
of the question?
absolutely. And just in regard to that, when you look around here today, you tend to see more of the AO, the Australian Opera's crowd, rather than a typical cross-section of Australia. How is it that you take the capital C out of culture?
Well, that's a good question too. I mean, just let me talk about opera for a second. I mean, we do have the world's most recognised opera house in the world. It's just turned 50, so it's unsurprising that there is a conversation, and a very active conversation, about what opera is and what it does, and I'm enthusiastic about that, and what it can be. I'm even more enthusiastic about. In terms of providing access to all Australians in all places, which is one of the things that we found from our Australian research that we undertook. You know, what do Australians really want? And they do want that experience, both for themselves, but particularly for that next generation, either their children or someone else's children, seeing that, you know, they are the audiences of the future. And peri-urban Australia is really significant in that, recognising that there's generally a shortage of cultural infrastructure on the outskirts of the major metropolitan cities, and yet that is the area that where issues of social cohesion, some of the health-related issues, some of the education-related issues are so significant. So part of the memo to government in this is that in meeting that interest in arts and culture more broadly, there are parts of the country that are underserviced. And it can't be expected of everyone that they'll hop on a train or a tram or a bus to every time they want to engage in a cultural experience. Some will want to walk to the corner of the road, and some will want to have other experiences that are of that community, not just experiences that are important to that community. So I think your question is a very apt one. The recognising arts and culture when it happens and when it's of you and you're in that space is something as well, which, hence my remark that when you're enjoying all of these things, for goodness sake, mention it to your local members, because I've described a very wide arc of arts and culture, and deliberately so. It's not just certain art forms, it's the whole experience of arts and culture in many, many dimensions. But know that it's that, and speak about it as it is that. And that's a very central part of this journey to Australia becoming a cultural powerhouse, to know what we've got and how to leverage from it.
Thanks. So that's why it's so important to have local council as part of your new cultural council.
Critical to have a seat at the table in that sort of national cabinet concept where a ministerial council is reporting at least once a year to national cabinet. The voices through local government are really essential to have the whole of Australia speaking.
Alex Sloan.
Hi, Rupert. Alex. Great to see you. Yes, I'm here with the Australia Institute, and we back great ideas, not political parties. I just want to acknowledge actually that Ingrid from Pub Choir is here in the audience today. So it's not just about the Australian Opera, and she got me through COVID with joy, with community and with love. And if you haven't checked out Pub Choir, do it. It'll make you happy.
And I should say, and with Daniel Riley as a board associate of a New York.
Rupert, how can we afford billions of dollars of tax cuts, but we can't afford to invest in the arts and creative industries? Are we missing our true selves?
Yeah, Alex, that's a very Alex Sloan question. I really like it. Look, I won't comment specifically on tax cuts because I think that's for another place, another time. But what we can truly afford, I think, is something that's relevant. In my remarks, I've been quite deliberate to say that in the style of the architecture that I'm speaking of, there is not a huge ask, and I think there's a risk sometimes that arts and cultural conversations all come down to the money question. I get, obviously, you know, there does need to be a respectable level of investment, and investment gives hope, and there are all sorts of other outcomes from it. But actually getting the conversation into another place, getting the recognition that arts and culture really matter as part of a discussion about national identity, to not have arts and culture get lost in the context of everything else that Australia is famous for. We know that we have a cultural tourism here of people coming from all parts of the world to see what we have. Do we ever talk about that? Well, not a lot. Generally, we think they're coming here for sort of hotel, quarry, farm stuff. But to be here and engaging deeply in the cultural life and expression of the country is at the heart of it. In ANA's last report, 87% of all revenue coming into this sector comes from actually people buying tickets. It's not government support at all. And I think it reflects the fact, therefore, that what government has to do is be really strategic about the way in which it makes that investment, knowing that there's a large audience.
Does it come down to our culture, though? If we look at France, they would never destroy the Louvre or the caves at Lascaux, no matter how much coal was underneath it, but will destroy the world's most famous and wonderful art gallery, the Burrup Peninsula. Is there just our values are wrong? Well,
look, I think part of the conversation in that, and I respect the French for what they've done too, but part of the answer to that is in the national cabinet approach. I made the comment that to have arts issues, arts-related matters dealt with only within the arts portfolio doesn't give the opportunity for all of those ideas to be expressed more fully across the whole of government. So for a sophisticated, complex discussion, such as the one that you're speaking of, that's the place for that to play out. And at the moment, it doesn't quite do that.
I'm just a final one. I'm just wondering how many young children, and was young Rupert asked at school by the school counsellor, the jobs counsellor, why don't you go into the arts? I just wonder how many times that's put to school kids. Because I just think it starts at that level. It's undervalued. Go be an accountant, be a doctor. Yeah. But no, don't go into the arts.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because in primary school, they start really early. I've just heard from, I called out Thursday Island before. Bangara is up there at the moment giving performances in front of school children. And they've been in Darwin and having a daughter who's a school teacher with some of the kids some of the children that went to the presentation, they were asked to write something when they came back, and all these hands were going up saying, how do we spell incredible, miss?
Ella Hodgman.
Thank you, Mr. Myer. This is just a question from one of our directors who's watching, David Crow, and it's sort of a follow-up on Alex's question, but in the budget submissions for the ANA this year, your organisation sought $3.16 million over 3 years to boost cultural policy. Are you seeing any action on your specific proposals, and what do you hope for the May budget next year?
Look, again, it's another version of the money question, which I'm not shirking away from. But we've got a large number of reports with very specific points of engagement with the sector and others that are available. I mean, what we really want is a conversation that changes the status of arts and culture. Last year in the budget speech, it was the first time that arts and culture were mentioned in the bit that went to television. That's a very major achievement, so that means in the first half hour of the speech. Maybe our ambition is it gets mentioned twice next time, but that it has a bigger place in the way in which everything is considered.
Okay, I have a question here from Tim Shaw, who's also a director and also watching at home. He says, Australia is a multicultural nation. How does the lens of your cultural powerhouse proposal avoid exclusion of many of the diaspora that is now the new Australia?
Yeah, look, I think that's why I've tried to be at pains to say that what we have here that's particularly unique is this entwinement between our ancient culture and the cultures of every country on earth. And it is the responsibility of the nation to recognise that that's what we are. That's exactly who we are. So creating access and the ability for participation in the cultural life of the country is exactly responding in that way. Whether those communities are living regionally or peri-urban Australia, or whether they're right in the centre of the city, to have access to cultural experiences that relate directly to communities that they know. but to all of the other forms of cultural engagement that are available throughout the country.
Okay, Tom McElroy.
Thank you again. Sorry to draw you back to the money question. The federal government's got a goal of doubling philanthropy in Australia by the end of the decade. The Productivity Commission's been tasked with working on that as well. I'm interested in your observations on that goal and what might be done to get there, and the opportunity for cultural institutions and the broader picture.
Yeah. I should say ANA doesn't shirk the money question at all. It's clearly a critical part of the whole sector, and so I'm more than happy to talk further about that offline. I said in my remarks that and I'm aware of the policy of government to double the size of philanthropy. Philanthropy doesn't really dance to government's tune in that. It's one of the points of philanthropy being independent and private, and others having targets for it is not generally something that the sector can do easily, partly because the sector is so broad and so disparate. As I mentioned, if you've seen two philanthropic trusts, you've seen two philanthropic trusts. There's very often very little overlap, and although there are peak bodies and very good ones, Philanthropy Australia and others, and there are lots of public forums in which these sorts of discussions take place, philanthropy, I think, will dance to its own tune. Happily, I suspect that the alignment between government and philanthropy is probably not too far out of step here. There are waves of new philanthropic structures that are being set up, and the the legislative infrastructure that was established 20 plus years ago of private ancillary funds has been a fabulous mechanism put in place by government to ensure that new foundations are able to be established. So I don't expect any shortage of existing individuals from contributing to their existing PAFs, or new PAFs being created by those who are wanting to create them for the first time. I think somewhere up here the objectives will meet, but they'll meet for slightly different reasons.
Thank you.
Melissa Code.
At the Women in Media conference in Sydney this year, there was a statistic shared about the hours that Australians on average spend on the internet every day, and it's about 6. And by far and away, the primary platform which takes up our time is, God forbid, TikTok. And I think about that fact and the question of what is culture, who owns culture, how accessible is it to all Australians? And I wonder if you have any views on, in advancing this conversation about culture and the role it plays for Australia moving forward, whether we should reimagine the idea of what cultural infrastructure is and contemplate digital assets as part of that narrative.
Yeah. Look, I think unquestionably every cultural institution in the country is thinking about its digital strategy and its AI strategy. And if they're not, they should be, because this is no small trend. This is something that's very significant. It's with us now, and there will be more of it in the future. I think in your earlier question on this sort of impact of AI, I answered by saying that a number of cultural organisations are already including in displays or performances different attributes of the digital environment, and that will continue. For Australians sort of spending so much time on the internet, I mean, I think a number of Australians would actually consider that was part of their cultural engagement. And in the work of ANA, the way you download your cultural experiences and the manner in which you select those cultures and art forms that you choose, the internet is right up there with everything else. So there's no differentiation, I think, between now I'm having a cultural experience, now I'm having an internet experience. Now it's seamless. It's all at once.
So there's something to be said about one's access to the internet facilitating the accessibility one has to reach full culture?
Yeah, I guess I might have missed the core point of the question. I'm sorry. Look, I think clearly internet accessibility is improving all the way around the country. So that should give an opportunity for someone living remotely, in a place like Kalkarinji to engage in a performance that's happening in a metropolitan area. And that's part of the point of the recognition across Australia of access being available for everyone. That should certainly be the ambition. And part of the conversation that would spark then is someone sitting somewhere else engaging with that person, and the sense of being part of an audience and part of a community that's come together around a cultural performance. That's part of the magic of the environment that we're moving into.
Final question, Nick Stewart.
Devil's advocate case, why not just give up? Why not just let it rip? I mean, if people want to watch US TV, let them download it and watch it. Why bother?
Look, well, it matters, and it matters a lot. I mean, we're not having a nice-to-have conversation. There is something germane to the nation's identity about getting this piece right. And we have an opportunity to do it and be really significant. And that's, I think, a great opportunity for this country. I don't think any of us should be concerned that there are Australians who would choose to watch American sitcoms. I mean, that's fine. I mentioned it's fine that they go to Taylor Swift and to Ed Sheeran as well. But if we're going to do those sorts of things in a global context, then let's be really discriminating and really well educated and really thoughtful about the sorts of cultural experiences we want from other places, because we have a way of benchmarking them across the things that really matter to us from those of us who are able to work together and participate and make them happen. I think that's a really important thing.
Okay. Thank you for your time today. I'd like to present you with a small gift, a 60th anniversary membership to the National Press Club. Please join me in thanking